With most works of literature, it is useful to know something about the author and the times in which he or she lived. This is not really true of the Odyssey. Later Greek sources give us a few not very useful scraps of information about the poet Homer, who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad around 700 BC. 7 cities claimed Homer as their citizen, and he's said to have been blind, although the richness of his visual imagery renders this doubtful.
Homer had the story and many of the lines of the Odyssey handed down to him by generations of oral poets. They told of the siege of Troy and the wanderings of heroes like Odysseus in the years between these events, occurring around 1200 BC. It so happens that we have an example of such an oral poet in Book 8 of the Odyssey, when a blind singer, Demodocus, tells us various tales.
She reft him of his eyes, but she gave him the sweet singing art. Pothinus set a silver-studded chair out for him in the middle of the feasters, propping it against a tall column, and the herald hung the clear lyre on a peg placed over his head, and showed him how to reach up with his hands and take it down, and set beside him a table and a fine basket, and beside him a cup to drink whenever his spirit desired it. They put forth their hands to the good things that lay ready before them. But when they had put away their desire for eating and drinking, the muse stirred the singer to sing the famous actions of men on that venture, whose fame goes up into the wide heaven.
Oral poets like Demodocus could be found at the beginning of this century in the former Yugoslavia, singing without the aid of any written notes poems as long as the Iliad or the Odyssey about events in the 14th century. Like the Odyssey, such poems contained repeated lines. Then the thoughtful Telemachus said to her in answer, and repeated phrases, dawn with her rosy fingers, and grey-eyed Athene, which the oral poet needs for the creation of his poem, recited in long sittings with few pauses or breaks.
Like the Odyssey, such poems contained digressions and discrepancies, inevitable when poems of such length are sung without the opportunity to check for coherence or relevance. Around the time of the discovery of writing, Homer welded together some disconnected oral lays into a grand literary design. In dealing with such a poem, we should not be concerned with complicated symbolic patterns, nor should we concentrate on particular words or phrases. Such sophistication is not helpful in a poem that originated from an oral tradition and is in any case inappropriate for a work studied in translation from its original Greek. But we can and do appreciate Homer's artistic design and moral philosophy.
Well, the Odyssey certainly comes from an oral tradition, which we can tell by some of the features of oral composition, such as the use of formulae, set phrases which occur whenever that essential idea has to be conveyed. We see this at the very small level of combinations of epithets and nouns, and we see it at the slightly larger level of typical scenes, which are repeated whenever a scene of that type has to be described, and we see it at a wider level in the use of typical themes, the disguised guest, the returning stranger, scenes of sacrifice, all that sort of thing.
The Odyssey was divided into 24 books, corresponding to the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet, 400 years after its composition. This division is not the work of Homer, but is obviously convenient. We can note a more interesting division of the poem into 6 parts, each lasting 4 books.
Homer was an entertainer. He had to produce a poem which would be gripping and would be new. The newest song is always best. That's what we're told in the Odyssey. And what's characteristic of Homer is that he always produces something which is surprising, different, original, even avant-garde. And when you look at the sorts of poems that must have been about in Homer's day, some of them were about the returns of heroes from Troy, the returns of all the heroes from Troy. What Homer did was to focus on the return of one particular hero and to build a whole lifestyle, a whole study of Greek culture around that single man. It was an inspiration.
The Odyssey is not just a series of oral lays strung together. It is a great epic poem. An epic poem is a poem that deals with fundamental problems in human life and tries to find an answer to them. And it is a curious feature of almost all epic poems that they involve the journey or the quest. Virgil's Aeneid and Paradise Lost both involve journeys. And the journey or the quest, a successful journey in the case of the Odyssey, is a very suitable subject for an epic poem.
In the first section, we hear of the adventures of Telemachus, Odysseus' son, unhappy in Ithaca because his father's kingdom and father's wife, Penelope, are at the mercy of a host of suitors. He goes in search of news of his father from Nestor and Menelaus, gaining wisdom and discretion as he proceeds. It may seem odd to begin in a comparatively minor key with Telemachus, although of course Odysseus is constantly mentioned, and the maturing of Telemachus will be paralleled by the growth of Odysseus in wisdom and understanding. The gods, particularly Athene, help Telemachus as they later help Odysseus. Indeed, the book opens with a council of the gods. Poseidon, god of the sea and arch-enemy of Odysseus, is absent.
First among them to speak was the father of gods and mortals, for he was thinking in his heart of stately Aegisthus, whom Orestes, Agamemnon's far-famed son, had murdered. Remembering him, he spoke now before the immortals. "Oh, for shame! How the mortals put the blame upon us gods, for they say evils come from us. But it is they, rather, who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given, as now lately, beyond what was given, Aegisthus married the wife of Atreus' son and murdered him on his homecoming, though he knew it was sheer destruction, for we ourselves had told him, sending Hermes, the mighty watcher, Argifontes, not to kill the man, nor court his lady for marriage."
The mention of Aegisthus is significant. Again and again we have references to a story parallel to that of Odysseus, but different. Agamemnon, unlike Odysseus, returned home after the Trojan War quickly and rashly. His wife, Clytemnestra, was, unlike Penelope, unfaithful, and with her suitor, Aegisthus conspired to murder him.
In Book 5, we join Odysseus, who has been languishing for 7 years on Calypso's island. Such a life does not seem too frightful, but Odysseus, eager to return home and eager for action, is unhappy.
Certainly Odysseus is mentioned in the very first word of the poem. The first word is man. "Tell me of the man" is the invocation to the muse, and yet we don't meet this man until 4 books later. This is the basic effect of retardation and the basic effect of expansion, which is the aesthetic on which Homeric epic poetry works. But also it allows us to see the gravity of the situation which Odysseus faces on his return. In the first 4 books we see the crisis that arises because Telemachus is now becoming a man and now has to do something about the situation of the suitors consuming his inheritance at Ithaca.
The first 4 books are all about his son, and they immediately highlight for us that the poem is about how a whole family works, and that the relationship between Telemachus and Odysseus is absolutely central to the poem. Telemachus must learn how to enter a world of heroic values, must learn what it is to be an adult, must learn to speak in assemblies, must learn to become Odysseus.
So spoke powerful Argifontes, and there he left her, while she, the queenly nymph, when she had been given the message from Zeus, set out searching after great-hearted Odysseus, and found him sitting on the seashore, and his eyes were never wiped dry of tears, and the sweet lifetime was draining out of him, as he wept for a way home, since the nymph was no longer pleasing to him. By nights he would lie beside her, of necessity, in the hollow caverns, against his will, by one who was willing. But all the days he would sit upon the rocks at the seaside, breaking his heart in tears and lamentation and sorrow, as weeping tears he looked out over the barren water.
The gods, represented by Hermes, ask Calypso to release Odysseus, and obediently she helps him to build a raft, and Odysseus lands on the island of Phaeacia, where he meets Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous. Wisely, Odysseus avoids any romantic entanglement with Nausicaa, although he has not always been so cautious, and it is more than once hinted that Nausicaa is ripe for such a romance. Wisely, too, he avoids revealing his identity until he learns from Demodocus's songs that he is respected in Phaeacia. He only then tells the story of his adventures.
Odysseus' account of his previous adventures in books 9 to 12 forms the best known and most exciting part of the Odyssey. Chronologically, they precede books 1 to 8, but had Homer started with them, the rest of the poem might have seemed something of an anticlimax. Alternatively, since in these books Odysseus encounters and escapes supernatural forces like Scylla and Charybdis, his adventures would seem incredible without the aid of books 1 to 8, in which we learn that Odysseus is an extraordinary man.
There are about 9 or so figures in the 4 books of Odysseus's main adventures, which he recounts himself. And some of these are obviously fantastic creatures, such as we do not meet in ordinary life. There's an element of fairy story here. I'm not sure we should try and read too much symbolism into the creatures like Polyphemus, Scylla, and Charybdis. It's true that in Bunyan's allegorical book, Pilgrim's Progress, he has this character, Giant Despair, who must, I suppose, originate from Polyphemus. But we get giants in Jack the Giant Killer and David and Goliath, and I don't think we can see much in Polyphemus except a great dangerous character whom somehow Odysseus gets the better of.
It's very interesting thinking about the mythic characters in the Odyssey. One thing people don't notice is that they only appear in books 9 to 12 of the Odyssey. It's a 24-book work, so that means they only appear in, about a sixth of it. They only appear in the story that Odysseus himself tells, as though it created a different register, a different sense of reality. We don't learn about Cyclopses and Scyllas and Charybdises outside that story. So they have a very limited distribution against the realism of the rest of the poem. Now, if you look at the monsters themselves, they are part of Odysseus' account of how he qualified to be the hero that is worth knowing about. So he is the man that survived the dangers which they posed, whereas others didn't. Notably, his comrades didn't. We're told on the first page of the poem that he's striving for his own return and the return of his comrades, but those comrades never make it, and it's their fault. Homer has created lots of tantalizing situations, very entertaining, yes, but they give a sense of meaning something. It means something that Odysseus endures and overcomes all temptations, and it means something that he knew how to resist the cattle of the sun, but his comrades did not, that he knew that the bag of the wind should not be opened, and it was only when he fell asleep through a moment's inattention that the whole thing came to bits.
Although Odysseus recounts his own story, and we are usually the heroes of stories we tell, he appears in a less admirable light in these books than in the rest of the poem. He gets the better of Polyphemus and Circe through some clever trickery and divine help, but he is foolish to reveal his real name to the Cyclops. This provokes the wrath of Poseidon, Polyphemus' father. With Circe, he is more cautious initially, but his stay with her is prolonged beyond the cause of duty. He reveals his relationship with his men was an uneasy one, but he does not take them into his confidence. Book 11, recounting Odysseus' visit to the underworld, contains portraits of people like Achilles and Agamemnon, who should have been warnings to Odysseus of the dangers of rash and amorous escapades.
There are, in fact, multiple parallels here. There's a parallel between Agamemnon himself and Odysseus. Agamemnon comes back quickly from Troy. He comes back as the successful victor. He comes back fully attended by all his men, and yet he's murdered by deception on his return. Contrast that with Odysseus, who takes 10 years to get home, who comes back alone, who uses deception himself and emerges as victor. So Odysseus obviously learns from Agamemnon's mistakes. There's a contrast in style of return, a contrast in their manner and their tactics based on the parallelism of the two stories.
The second half of the Odyssey includes the famous episode of the bow, where Penelope challenges the suitors to string Odysseus's bow. She knows that only Odysseus can do it. The moving scenes when Odysseus reveals himself first to his son in Book 16 and then to his wife in Book 23 are intimate and powerful. Both Telemachus and Penelope are cautious like Odysseus, and though initially skeptical, are eventually convinced. Their reunions are touching.
Then in turn, long-suffering great Odysseus answered him, "No, I am not a god. Why liken me to the immortals? But I am your father, for whose sake you are always grieving as you look for violence from others and endure hardships." So he spoke and kissed his son, and the tears running down his cheeks splashed on the ground. Until now he was always unyielding. But Telemachus, for he did not yet believe that this was his father, spoke to him once again in answer, saying, "No, you are not Odysseus, my father, but some divinity beguiles me, so that I must grieve the more and be sorry."
As well as the relationship between Odysseus and his wife, there's the relationship between Penelope and Telemachus, which is not an easy one at all, and it's not an easy one because of the absence of the father. The authority and status in the relationship between Telemachus and Penelope is not clear, not well defined. This is what the father is required for. When the father returns, we see that he enjoys a relationship with Penelope very different from that between Penelope and Telemachus. They're on the same wavelength, broadly. When Odysseus meets Nausicaa in Book 6, he tells her that the ideal between a man and his wife is like-mindedness. And this is very much what Penelope and Odysseus demonstrate.
Penelope is an extraordinary figure. Penelope is held up for comparison against another woman in Greek mythology, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is celebrated for having slaughtered her husband Agamemnon and having been unfaithful to him. Odysseus meets Agamemnon in the underworld, and Agamemnon draws the comparison between Clytemnestra and Penelope, saying that all women are a bad thing, but there is Penelope.
So he spoke, and her knees and the heart within her went slack as she recognized the clear proofs that Odysseus had given. But then she burst into tears and ran straight to him, throwing her arms around the neck of Odysseus, and kissed his head, saying, "Do not be angry with me, Odysseus, since beyond other men you have the most understanding. The gods granted us misery, in jealousy over the thought that we two, always together, should enjoy our youth, and then come to the threshold of old age. Then do not now be angry with me, nor blame me, because I did not greet you, as I do now, at first when I saw you."
We can still see Homer operating with the original blocks of 4 books. In books 13 to 16, Odysseus returns to his homeland of Ithaca disguised as a beggar. In books 17 to 20, still in the guise of a beggar, he shows great skill and restraint in not identifying himself when insulted by the suitors and when he is recognized by his old acquaintances.
Well, it fools Eumaeus, who's an old and trusted servant, and he certainly doesn't see through the disguise, and it fools Penelope herself, although there is a school of thought that Penelope secretly recognizes Odysseus, and this is also what one of the suitors themselves claims in Book 24, but there's no real evidence for a recognition which isn't explicitly signalled in the text. But of course, Argos the dog sees through the disguise, and he's overcome with joy at the return of his master and drops dead on the spot. And Eurycleia, the faithful old nurse, sees through the disguise. Okay, Odysseus is naked by this stage and he's being washed, but still, as well as the physical disguise of the rags, he's been made to look different by Athena as well. So you would think that she shouldn't recognise him, but she does.
In books 21 to 24, we have the contest of the bow, its savage outcome with the murder of the suitors, and the reunion of Penelope and Odysseus are all shocking and tender respectively. Homer entices and thrills his audience after this magnificent climax in the shape of the suitors going into the underground, Odysseus' reunion with his father, and mini-battle between his supporters and the friends of the suitors.
The Odyssey is the first and greatest story of a successful quest, and should have ended when the hero, against all odds, had reached his goal. Odysseus is admirable, if not totally so. Brave, resourceful, cunning and determined. He makes mistakes, but is prepared to learn from them. We note, for instance, his control of his tiny force against the suitors, contrasting with his previous treatment of his men. Telemachus makes a mistake and leaves a door open, which reveals Penelope's deception of the suitors, and Odysseus wastes no time in recrimination. We note his brilliant mixture of planning and improvisation in turning the contest of the bow to his own advantage. He is, of course, helped by Athene, but it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between the goddess of wisdom and Odysseus' own quick wits as the source of his inspiration.
As well as having a protectress in Athena, Odysseus has an enemy, a personal enemy in one of the gods, namely Poseidon. And this is for purely personal reasons, because of the fact that Odysseus blinded the son of Poseidon, Polyphemus the Cyclops. So he's constantly trying to frustrate Odysseus' return. Athena's constantly trying to promote his return. He has one divine enemy, one divine friend.
The relationship of Athene and Odysseus is very interesting. It's very close. It's hard for us to define that closeness without importing some sort of, I suppose in a modern circumstance, you'd import some sort of sexual content to it. However, when you look at it, they behave like old pals, and the key moment is that moment in Book 13 when Athene is talking to Odysseus and reviling him for just having told her a pack of lies, and he realises at that moment that it was Athene, and of course protests that she hasn't helped him enough. An astonishing thing to say to your protecting divinity when finally it makes itself known.
Now, it might seem that the help given by the gods, and particularly by Athene, rather detracts from the heroism of Odysseus. If he gets so much help, he is less of an independent character. But I don't think that's quite so, because Athene is, after all, the goddess of wisdom. And sometimes, in talking about inspiration from Athene, we get the impression that really Odysseus' own quick wits are what inspires him. And I think, in fact, we can read this book without too much worry about these gods coming heavily on and off the stage. We can read it just as a story of human ingenuity.
The monsters Odysseus encounters in books 9 to 12 are, on the one hand, fantastic creatures out of fairy tales, but they also have a symbolic significance. Circe, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis are all female and can be seen as temptations that beset Odysseus on his way. Scylla and Charybdis have of course become a proverbial expression for two equally difficult choices. As already shown, Odysseus is vulnerable to other women, although his infidelity with Circe and Calypso do not seem to be questioned. And then there is the power of some of the speeches. This extract is taken from the episode of the bow, where Penelope states the challenge.
Hear me now, you haughty suitors, who have been using this house for incessant eating and drinking, though it belongs to a man who has been gone for a long time. Never have you been able to bring any other saying before me, but only your desire to make me your wife and marry me. But come, you suitors, since here is a prize set out before you, for I shall bring you the great bow of the godlike Odysseus. And the one who takes the bow in his hands, strings it with greatest ease, and sends an arrow clean through all the 12 axes, shall be the one I go away with, forsaking this house where I was a bride, a lovely place and full of good living. I think that even in my dreams I shall never forget.
But the thought that one day it will be a pleasure to remember even the bad times on a journey is one to comfort travellers at all times. And then there is the sad lament of Achilles to the effect that all of his heroism is pointless now that he is dead.
So I spoke, and he in turn said to me in answer, O shining Odysseus, never try to console me for dying. I would rather follow the plough as thrall to another man, one with no land allotted to him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead.
The message of the Odyssey, that it is important to stay alive, is clearly a valuable one, rather different from the message of the Iliad, where heroism is so important. But the Odyssey, with its sense of fun and of excitement, does show us also that life is worth living.
Experts on the Odyssey often point to the use of continuing themes in the poem. So, for instance, you're always coming across the theme of xenia, of guest friendship. And at first sight, it can be rather puzzling that there should be a theme to write a 24-book epic about how you treat strangers, how you should ask them questions when they've just had dinner, how it is impolite if you are a one-eyed monster to eat your guests, and even more impolite to eat them raw. And through all this theme and variations, all these different little situations, piece by piece, a whole story is built up of how society really works, how people can live together, what the real values are that bond people together.
I'm not sure that it wants specifically to give us a message as such, but it is very much an exemplary sort of poem. Odysseus is an example to the audience and the readership of the poem. And he is so in a way which is rather different from the characters of the Iliad. He's an example of a type of heroism that relies on perseverance, symbolised by his clinging to this plank after he's shipwrecked. He holds on for dear life, and he always does throughout the poem. And also self-control is his other main characteristic. And the reason that he is persevering and self-controlled is that he wants to get home, and he wants to get home to his house and his wife. So marriage is a very, very important theme in the poem, and with marriage belong the other institutions of civilization.
The Odyssey is a shining example of Greek epic, which has had a monumental effect on world literature throughout the ages. The central message of the Odyssey is that the trials and triumphs of the journey that test Odysseus' character and courage are defining experiences for him. As such, they become much more important than the reason for his trip or even his safe arrival home. From Beowulf to El Cid to the modern-day road movie, the epic quest or Odyssey of our heroes has been a focus for entertainment and self-discovery for every generation. The poetry of Anglo-Saxon England is the oldest English poetry in existence, but it is also the fruit of even older traditions and practices. Among the members of the Germanic tribes who were the continental ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons, poetry satisfied a number of basic needs. These pre-literate cultures depended solely on the spoken word to express their beliefs, to preserve their history, and to provide their entertainment. Their poets, whose task it was to shape the spoken word fittingly for these purposes, played an essential part in all of them.
The first thing to realize about Anglo-Saxon poetry, I think, is that it's not really an early stage of English poetry. It's a late stage of Germanic poetry, because the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic peoples who came over bringing with them a really quite ancient tradition of poetry, and that is carried on when they were in England. This means in particular that the metre and style of all Anglo-Saxon poetry really is in the traditional Germanic mode, and that means alliterative verse, which is unlike modern verse in having no rhyme, doesn't count syllables, and also in the language which goes along with the metre really. So in those technical respects, it's pretty pure Germanic verse and comparable to the kind of thing you find in early German verse.
The figures that the poet presents are set firmly in a 4th or 5th century pagan reality. Now this is a past that for an Anglo-Saxon Christian was beyond hope. They lived without the benefit of the Christian revelation. Their souls as pagans would inevitably be damned after their death, and there was basically no hope for them. The problem for the Anglo-Saxons was that they came to England as a pagan Germanic culture which prized ancestry and prized genealogy as a major value in its whole cultural scheme. And they were very reluctant to give up on their ancestors in some ways. And many critics have seen Beowulf as an attempt at a kind of salvage project that could never be fully carried out because the poet would be up against the demands of his theology, which required that these characters be damned in the end. But nevertheless, he seems determined to present them to us in as favorable a light as possible. These are the most noble pagans imaginable. Beowulf fulfills the heroic ideal virtually without putting a foot wrong ever. In the end, the poet has to present this to us as not quite enough from a Christian perspective, but he plays with perspective in the poem very, very carefully and allows himself as much sympathy towards the heroic pagan past as a medieval Christian author could allow himself.
Nothing survives of the poetry the Germanic tribes composed, but the later poetry of Anglo-Saxon England responds quite strongly to its influence. The expressions of Christian belief and doctrine that are the primary concern of most Anglo-Saxon poets are shot through with the language, style, and sensibilities of their continental predecessors.
Although the language and verse form of Anglo-Saxon poetry is purely Germanic, it's disappointing how little there is of Germanic antiquity and paganism in Anglo-Saxon poetry. If you feel there might be exciting stuff about the Germanic gods and so on, you find really rather little. And most of what we know about Germanic religion, Woden and Thor and blood axes and so on, is derived not from Anglo-Saxon sources but from Scandinavian sources. But there are heroic legends that you find, again, not as many as you might hope, but still there are some, certainly in Beowulf and another poem called Weedseath. But on the whole, it's rather disappointing in that respect.
How the Germanic past influenced the Anglo-Saxon poet stands out the most fully in Beowulf, which is considered by modern scholars to represent one of the greatest literary achievements of Anglo-Saxon England. Beowulf is thought to have been composed between 700 and 750 AD, and is known to us because of a single surviving manuscript that dates back approximately to 1000 AD.
One has to remember that there are only about 30,000 lines of Anglo-Saxon poetry surviving in only 4 manuscripts. And what we have is not the sort of Oxford book of Anglo-Saxon verse, the best. What we have is what 4 monks chose to copy. And among other things, they chose to copy Beowulf, rather surprisingly, really. I think the man who copied Beowulf was probably actually interested in monsters, and he was compiling an Oxford Book of Monsters, if you like. So there's no guarantee at all that Beowulf was the best of its type in Anglo-Saxon history, but it's the best of its type surviving. Having said that, I don't mean that it isn't any good. It is very good, but we don't know whether it was a classic in its time.
Listen, we've had word of the might of the Spear Danes, kings of the people in ancient days, how those princes performed deeds of great valour. From hosts of enemies, from many nations, did Shield Shaving often seize their mead hall benches, striking terror into their leaders, long after he first was found, a destitute foundling. He knew some comfort for that, growing great beneath the skies, thriving in worldly honours, until every neighbouring tribe across the sea was compelled to obey him and offer him tribute. That was a good king.
The Shield Shaving mentioned here is not an English hero, but the legendary founder of a 5th century Danish dynasty, who is alluded to in a number of ancient Germanic legends. We know too little about the composition of Beowulf to understand exactly why the poet chose a Scandinavian setting for his great work. But the world he depicts in these opening lines is a pre-Christian Germanic world that haunts the verse of nearly every Anglo-Saxon poet whose work has survived. From the comparatively civilized times of the Beowulf poet, the early days were an age of stark contrast. The peace and mutual goodwill of the mead hall faced at every turn the threat of treason and violence. Violence of men, violence of nature, violence of monsters.
The author of Beowulf uses material from the Germanic past for a number of reasons. First, to give a semi-realistic historical background to the poem. Although his character is a legendary monster killer, the poet is able to put him in a historical setting that would have a great deal of resonance for his immediate audience. Beyond that, the historical material provides a contrast with the legendary matter of Beowulf's own career. In this, it provides a human perspective on the superhuman excellence of Beowulf, where Beowulf's combats with Grendel, with Grendel's mother, and with the dragon are reasonably uncomplicated affairs morally. These are figures of supernatural evil whom Beowulf is entirely justified in killing as he does. The stories of human conflict, of the passions that engender it, of the cultural situations that give rise to it, all emphasize the tangled and difficult and morally compromised character of the heroic ideal on the ground in real time, so that you have an idealized portrait of it in Beowulf contrasted against a realistic analysis of it in all its glories and failings, that's played out in the context of the historical matter. As well, history in a sense swallows this poem at the end. Beowulf dies thinking that the dragon hoard he's uncovered will be the salvation of his people, whereas various narrators in the wake of Beowulf's death let the audience know in no uncertain terms that Beowulf's death is an unmitigated disaster for his people. He's ruled them well for 50 years, and there is no one to replace him, and they are ringed with hostile peoples who will come swarming in for the kill in the wake of Beowulf's death, sooner or later. And these are the peoples that have been involved in the historical feuding with Beowulf's people, so that they are historical figures themselves and will come barging in on the poem like an unwelcome intrusion of reality into the slightly more unreal fairy tale aspect of the poem with its dragon-slaying hero.
The reputation of Scyld and of every other leader who appears in Beowulf rests on their success as protectors of their people through wise government and martial prowess. The individual hero, such as Beowulf himself, demonstrates his worth by living up to the heroic ideal that informs most Germanic literature. This ideal demands that the truly worthy man be above all honest and loyal, true to his lord, and a keeper of all his promises.
The author of Beowulf is drawn to what I call the edges of the heroic ideal in a number of ways. He tells quite a few stories along with the story of Beowulf. Modern critics refer to these as digressions, although they're generally linked very closely to the matter of the main tale. And in these, he presents us with persons and situations where the heroic ideal simply ceases to function for various reasons. Some of them involve simply bad kings who don't rule well. Some of them involve good kings who find themselves in nevertheless hopeless situations. The character of Hrothgar at the poem's opening is a classic example of this. The poet is very definite about his being a good king, yet he finds himself unable to defend his meat hall against the monsters who are haunting it.
Those who fulfill the ideal receive its greatest blessings, honour and protection in the mead hall, and the rich gifts that their lord distributes with great ceremony to show his regard for his followers' loyalty.
Well, I think Germanic poetry had always been inclined towards heroic subjects, and certainly the surviving Anglo-Saxon poetry has a lot of heroism in it, of two types really. There's a lot of what one might call Christian heroism. Treatments of saints, for example, represent them as heroes fighting in God's cause against the devil, against God's adversaries. And in The Dream of the Rood, Christ is represented very much in a heroic fashion. He strips himself for battle when he approaches the cross, for example. But the more obvious form of heroism to us is the heroism of ordinary men fighting enemies, and there's a good deal of that in Anglo-Saxon poetry. The poem called The Battle of Maldon, which comes from the very end of the Anglo-Saxon period, sometime in the 990s, getting on for 1066, is an example of that. It's a poem based on an actual battle between the men of Essex, who in those days were heroic, and the Vikings. And the leader of the Essex men, Byrhtnoth, is certainly conceived in a heroic vein, although he's also criticised for a sort of heroic rashness. And there is a sense here and in other Anglo-Saxon poems that heroes can get carried away and risk themselves and their followers unnecessarily simply out of their high heart.
This is the heroic ideal in brief. It is explored and celebrated by the poets of Anglo-Saxon England, who enter into extreme circumstances to test the ideal. To help us understand Beowulf in context, it is important to look at other Anglo-Saxon poetry. The late 10th century poem known as the Battle of Maldon, for instance, celebrates a famous English defeat. A succession of English warriors give voice to the heroic ideal as they face the stark choice between death in battle and the coward's shame should they flee.
Here shall they herdra, herda fikenra.
Thought must be the sterner, heart the keener, spirit the higher, as our strength dwindles. Here lies our leader, cut down in death, that good man stretched out on the earth. Whoever thinks to flee now from this battle play shall lament it bitterly forever.
Beowulf addresses the theme of exile in a number of different ways. Most prominently, in the case of the monsters, Grendel and his mother, who are the first on the scene in the poem, the poet describes them as descended from a race of giant beings who ultimately were descended from Cain, the first murderer. And God has exiled these because of Cain's sin in killing Abel. They're cosmic exiles, if you like, as figures of profound evil. At the end of the poem, Beowulf is fighting this dragon which has been guarding a hoard of ancient wealth. And the poet tells the story of this wealth and how it came to be buried beneath the earth by the last survivor of a culture whose material remains the gold represents. And this figure has a little song that he chants as he's putting the last of the gold in. It's often referred to as the Song of the Last Survivor, where he is in a state of mourning over his culture, which is now vanished. He's the sole representative of it, and it takes up many of the themes of exile that we see in other poems like The Wanderer. Rather ironically, the dragon's raids are prompted by the theft of a cup from his hoard, which was committed by another solitary character who appears to have fallen out of favor with his lord and is in something like that condition of exile, who stumbles on the hoard and takes the cup in an effort to buy back his lord's favor. And it's his exile, if you like, that is the spark that sets off the final crisis in the poem that will lead to Beowulf's death.
If a man was cast out from society for criminal behavior, or if by chance or cowardly design he outlived his lord, he suffered the horror of exile. This is the worst fate that can befall any member of a heroic society, where individual identity depends wholly on the support and structure of the entire community. This narrator of the old English 8th century elegy known as The Wanderer stands in just such a predicament and gives eloquent testimony to the grief it entails. In terms of style and content, The Wanderer is often compared to The Seafarer, another 8th century poem in alliterative verse. Experts generally agreed that both poems are consistently Christian with a coherent theme, namely that of faith relieving man's loneliness. The Wanderer then appeals to others who have had similar experiences.
He who has experienced it knows how sorrow is a hideous companion to him who has few dear friends. The paths of exile claim him, not highly wrought gold, ice in his heart, not fame on earth. He remembers hall men and the giving of treasure, how his gracious lord in his youth used to show him favour. All joy has perished.
One of the pivotal moments in the history of Anglo-Saxon England was the coming of the mission led by St. Augustan of Canterbury in 597, which resulted in the eventual conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Some poets explored the mysteries of the new faith, using the images and ideals of the heroic tradition, depicting Christ as a successful warrior king.
There is a lot of Christian poetry in the 4 manuscripts. You've got to remember that those 4 manuscripts were written by monks, that is, they were copied by monks, and therefore they would favour Christian material, and they certainly did favour Christian material. There are versions of Bible stories, a poem called Genesis, another called Exodus. Actually, Genesis is a very interesting poem. There are also quite a lot of poems on saints' lives, Saint Juliana and so on. The best of the Christian poems, and a very, very remarkable poem, is The Dream of the Rood, which is an account of, a sort of account, of the crucifixion of Christ in a very Germanicized way, really, in that Christ is represented as a hero conquering his enemies, and it's quite different from the sort of thing that one's accustomed to perhaps later, the suffering Christ and so on.
The Dream of the Rood was one of the earliest poems, written before 750 AD, as carvings recorded from around this time suggest. It is generally regarded as one of the finest, most original, and perfectly constructed religious poems. The author of The Dream of the Rood, the poem that most strikingly blends heroic and Christian themes, creates an impossible paradox in heroic terms. But in Christian terms, he illuminates the central mystery of Christ's victory over death.
I could have laid our enemies low, completely, but I stood fast. The young warrior stripped himself. That was Almighty God, strong and resolute. He climbed the lofty gallows, high-spirited in the sight of many, when he desired to free mankind. I trembled when that man embraced me, but still I did not dare to bend to the ground or fall upon the surface of the earth, for I had to stand fast. I was lifted up, the cross, and I raised high the mighty King.
The cross is personified here and depicts itself as a loyal follower of its Lord Christ, whom it describes as a Germanic warrior advancing boldly to battle. Yet the cross's loyalty requires that it obey its Lord's command to stand fast and become the instrument of his death, a death which medieval Christian theology interpreted as actually being Christ's moment of triumph. From this perspective, the cross's loyalty serves its Lord's purpose after all. With this unnerving dislocation of the heroic ideal, the poet has taken an abstract theological concept and made it accessible.
The Dream of the Rood views a Christian paradox through the lens of heroic ideals. Beowulf looks in the other direction. Its author regards his idealized hero from the vantage point of a Christian who feels every sympathy for the triumphs and tragedies of his pagan characters.
Despite his sympathy, the Beowulf poet acknowledges the essential hopelessness of the heroic paradigm repeatedly throughout the poem. Here, he describes how Hrothgar, the descendant of Scyld-Shaving, has built a magnificent mead hall, a material symbol of his culture's yearning for order and harmony.
He did not fail of his boast. He distributed rings, treasures at his feast. The hall towered, lofty and wide-gabled. It awaited the destructive billowing of hateful fire. It was not yet the time when the sword-hate of son-in-law and father-in-law should awaken in deadly enmity.
Here it is the moment of triumph that contains the hidden seeds of disaster. The poet sees the new-built hall in all its glory as awaiting its eventual destruction in a feud between Hrothgar's people and those of his son-in-law, Ingelt. This was a well-known event in Germanic legend, the common stock of legend and history shared by the poet and his audience allows him to make this allusion to the fate of Hrothgar's hall with such economy.
Many of the mead hall scenes in Beowulf involve a great deal of ritual and ceremony. These express the Anglo-Saxon author's ideal of a well-ordered society, and they involve rituals and ceremonies of address, of gift-giving, of the passing around of the mead cup, of course. And all of these help to cement the bonds and ties of loyalty and trust that underpin Anglo-Saxon society, at least as a literary ideal. Beyond this, we can see how the crises in the main narrative of Beowulf, the assaults of the monsters, both those of Grendel and his mother and those of the dragon at the end, are directed in the first instance at a mead hall. It's Hrothgar's mead hall that is haunted by Grendel and his mother and made uninhabitable by night, and it's Beowulf's own mead hall that is destroyed by the dragon in his first raids. And this represents the threat from the outside to that great good place, which is the sheltered space where all the ideals of heroic society can be fully realized.
The poet also combines folklore and Christian tradition to give depth to his portrait of Beowulf's first two adversaries, the monster Grendel and his unnamed mother, who haunt Hrothgar's hall by night and devour any they find there.
The
Creator had banished him among the race of Cain. The everlasting Lord avenged that murder when he slew Abel. He had no joy from that assault, for the Lord exiled him far from the race of men for his crime. All sorts of unnatural progeny arose from him, evil spirits and elves and giants as well, who warred with God for many ages. He gave them their reward for that.
It's a rather striking feature of Beowulf that the poem's hero, who over the course of a long career has many combats with human adversaries, that the poet never really focuses on those. The main narrative is involved with Beowulf's combats with the three monsters. And in the first instance, this does at least simplify the moral background. In all of the stories that the poet does have to tell about human conflict, of humans fighting humans, he focuses inevitably on situations where the heroic code has broken down, where human passions can no longer be contained, where there's a great deal of moral ambiguity, inevitably, in the rights and wrongs of what happens. So that in the first instance, focusing on Beowulf's monster fights simplifies the moral background. It gives Beowulf clearly evil adversaries against whom he must contend, and there's absolutely no question about that. What is interesting is, as Beowulf nears the end of his life, as he's approaching his fight with the dragon, memories of his career as an earthly warrior start crowding back in on him. He has long passages where he recalls his lord Heoloc's disastrous raid where Heoloc dies and Beowulf barely escapes, and many other events in the history of Beowulf's own people, the Geats, in their contentions with various human adversaries. And it's almost as though, as Beowulf is coming to his own end, he's beginning to be overwhelmed by the human dimension of the heroic ideal, which has been absent to a great extent from his main endeavors in his fights with the monsters. And again, this could be another way of the poet showing us, in the end, the inadequacy of the heroic ideal, even as excellently embodied as it was by his main character.
The poet makes Grendel more than just a Germanic bogeyman. He is here given a lineage that goes back to Cain, the first murderer. There are also apocryphal traditions that identify the giants mentioned in the book of Genesis as the offspring of unions between earthly women and fallen angels. The poet was probably aware of these traditions, so he is here extending Grendel's horrific ancestry right back to God's original opponents, the fallen angels who rebelled against him in the deep past. From this perspective, the nightly visitations in Hrothgar's hall become skirmishes in the cosmic battle between good and evil that has gone on since before time itself. A battle which Anglo-Saxon Christians believed themselves to be engaged in as well. By having Beowulf triumph over such a creature as Grendel, the poet has paid him the highest compliment a medieval Christian author could offer a pagan hero.
It's no good pretending that everyone can enjoy Anglo-Saxon poetry. Apart from anything else, the language is very opaque. If I recite to you the opening lines of Beowulf, you'll see what I mean. What we gardene in jerdachum, theod kuninge thrum jufrunon. It's totally unintelligible to a modern English person through linguistic change, of course. So one has to learn the language, and that's a rather painful process, in fact, as many undergraduates find. But if one does learn the language and is able to read it in the original, as distinct from translations, although there are good translations, certainly, of Beowulf, but if you read it in the original, one does, I think, enter a world of extremely high and developed art. The quality of the writing, I suppose, is one thing one would want to say. It's a strange kind of writing. It's not the kind of writing that we're accustomed to. The metre is different and so on. And yet it's very polished and very brilliant. There is also, if you ask what appeals to me personally, I suppose the main thing, apart from the excellence of it, is the melancholy which broods over most of it. It is a deeply melancholy verse, as recorded in the four manuscripts. And Beowulf has a very strong sense of the sadness of life and the transience of things. And these seem to be profound truths which one can read about in poems like that to some effect.
The restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 marked the beginning of a new era, not only for English society, but also for English culture. In drama, in music, in art, the century following the accession of King Charles II was a golden age for England. In poetry, too, the confident English nation produced some of its finest ever men of verse. Three in particular defined the poetic spirit of their time: John Dryden, Alexander Pope, and Samuel Johnson. Their works were often inspired by the events of their day. More than at any time before, contemporary events provided the subject matter for great English verse. But their work also drew inspiration from the classical past, from the literary achievements of ancient Rome. Together, Dryden, Pope, and Johnson remain the greatest poets of the English Augustan Age.
This period is generally known as the Augustan Age because poets of this period model themselves on the poets who wrote under the Emperor Augustus, poets such as Horace and Virgil, and they had a similar sense of being close to the centre of power. More generally, the notion of Augustanism is a useful framework for considering the ways in which these poets responded to the changing aspects of their modern world. This was a period of enormous financial, social and economic upheaval in England. You saw the beginning of the financial revolution, the beginning of speculative investment in the 1690s, an enormous explosion also in publishing, with all kinds of writers coming into the marketplace for the first time, including women writers. And Augustanism was a kind of lens within which these poets responded to these changes critically and with a sense of the ways in which the values of the past were being altered, but never, I think, entirely nostalgically or in a reactionary manner.
The elite of the time, especially the literary elite, were highly trained in classical literature and saturated with a sense of classical illusions, and so it was natural for them to express English aspirations in terms of an attempt to emulate the greatness of Rome under the first emperor, Augustus, itself a time of prosperity, rebuilding, and of a great literary revival.
If you were a cultural historian, you would look about what happened in the Restoration and into the 18th century as being a time when poetry could lay claim to having public influence. We're used to the lyrical mode, I think, in the main now. We're used to poets being tolerated if they're not poets laureate. But there was a sense in which they were trying to find a way that a literate person of the 18th century ought to read poetry, ought to be influenced by specifically poetic effects. And I think that this may not be the vogue nowadays for understanding the poet writing in a very individual way, writing lyrically. But it's the last time, I think, there is fully available a whole range of different generic options, which are exploited usually in very successful ways by practicing poets.
The restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 was greeted by many English citizens with a profound sense of relief. With the return of the House of Stuart to the throne, the wounds of civil war could at last begin to heal. Many were simply rapturous at the turn of events. Shortly after the monarchy returned, one 29-year-old poet found himself joyously recalling in verse the moment when King Charles II returned from exile to his homeland.
How shall I speak of that triumphant day when you renewed the expiring pomp of May, a month that owns an interest in your name? You and the are its peculiar claim.
The poet responsible for these enthusiastic lines was John Dryden. At the time, he was a young man just beginning to make his mark in London's literary circles. His work over the decades that followed would secure his literary reputation forever. He was the first great English poet of an age which is perhaps less well known than the metaphysical age that preceded it or the Romantic period that came after. But it was an age that produced some of the most distinctive verse in the whole of English literary history. It was a time when many poets were keen to look back to the greatest days of Roman literature, to Horace, Virgil, and the finest writers of the early empire. The work of Dryden, and later that of Pope and Johnson, would be characterized by the same balanced, rational approach adopted by the Roman greats. And the age in which they worked has become known by the same name as the greatest period of Roman literary achievement, the Augustan Age.
If you were to call the Augustan period an age of reason, I think you might find it rather difficult to square with what you will find a lot of commentators mentioning, a real fear that that wasn't the reality of the case. In 1690, John Locke published his essay concerning human understanding. And in that, he offers the disturbing reflection that all of our thought processes, no matter how complex, immediately take their rise from sense impressions, from experience, which might, in their own origins, be extremely anarchic. It's up to the individual to sort of marshal them, to sort them, to filter them, so that sense may be made of them. But out there, there's a sense in which things are not so ordered. And that has certain effects on the way the 18th century sees itself, especially a sense of the need for order, the sense of a creation of order, which has to take place, because order can't naturally be found.
Chronologically, John Dryden is the first of the three great poets of the English Augustan Age. The clarity and solidity of his finest verse was unrivalled in the later 17th century. Yet, for many, Dryden the man remains a difficult character to fully appreciate. Born in 1631 and educated at Westminster and Cambridge, by 1660 he was in London writing his appreciation of King Charles' return. Yet just the year before, his first published volume included verse praising Oliver Cromwell, the man who had forced the monarchy to flee. It would not be the last time that John Dryden would alter his viewpoint dramatically. If his apparent shift in loyalty was to advance his own position, it undoubtedly succeeded. He became well known in royal circles, and in 1663 his connections with the courtier Sir Robert Howard secured the hand of his daughter Elizabeth in marriage. In the years after the Restoration, Dryden became one of London's leading literary figures, and his work was very much a product of his times. As a dramatist, he wrote popular plays castigating the opponents of the king. As a poet, he was similarly inspired by contemporary events. In 1667, he produced his first great work, Annus Mirabilis, a poetic account of certain events of the previous year. In it, he describes great achievements of the English Navy. He also recalls one of the most momentous events in the history of the City of London.
In this deep quiet, from what source unknown, those seeds of fire their fatal birth disclose, and first few scattering sparks about were blown, big with the flame that to our ruin rose. Then, in some close-pent room it crept along, and smouldering as it went in silence fed, till the infant monster with devouring strong walks boldly upright with exalted head.
The event that Dryden described was, of course, the Great Fire of London, and his decasyllabic lines represent just one positive outcome of that unfortunate event.
Annus Mirabilis is a remarkable poem. Most of the poem tells the story of the war against the Dutch, which ended inconclusively just as the poem was being written. The poem then moves on to the Fire of London and ends with a prophecy that the city will be rebuilt and become the imperial capital of the world. What's so unusual about the poem is the fact that it's truly a national poem. A good deal of it is written in the first person plural, and although King Charles II is present in the poem, he stands to one side as a kind of father figure, so that the real drama is the suffering and the hopes for the future of the people of England.
Annus Mirabilis was a huge popular success, and not long after its publication, John Dryden became the state poet of England, the poet laureate. Yet his dignified, measured account of the events of 1666 is not an entirely typical Dryden work. Its rhyme structure was not that with which he is most associated. For his best-known work, he did use the decasyllabic line, but rhyming successively in the two-line couplet, each line constructed from 5 iambic feet. In English poetry, this is known as the heroic couplet, and it would become one of the key features of the poetry of the Augustan Age.
The heroic couplet is called the heroic couplet because it was used for the English translations of the great classical epics of Virgil and Homer. That was the chosen form. So the heroic couplet has a tremendous expansive epic dignity, but it's also very suitable for conversational poetry. The length of the line enacts the length of normal conversational rhythms, and so it's an eminently sociable form of literature, and it's also an eminently logical and rational form in the kind of tightness of control, the balance and the logical patternings which are presented.
The heroic couplet, as one of my students actually commented, is a form by which you resolve things, or you appear to resolve things. It's got a kind of balance in the couplet itself. You can work out a satisfying level of variety which is contained by that's every second line, the rhyme word, cutting up the sense unit so that you appear to have resolved things, you appear to have gathered up experience and concentrated a comment about it.
Dryden's use of the heroic couplet can be enjoyed in what is, for many, his finest work, Absalom and Achitophel, published in 1681. Like Annus Mirabilis, it is a poem entirely of its age, and not only because of its structure. In its subject matter and its attitude, it typifies the Augustan spirit. It is ostensibly a poem of biblical inspiration. On the surface, it tells the story of the king's sons, the Absalom and Achitophel of its title, with the latter described in unforgiving terms.
Of these, the false Achitophel was first, a name to all succeeding ages cursed, for close designs and crooked counsels fit, sagacious, bold, and turbulent of wit, restless, unfixed in principles and place, in power unpleased, impatient of disgrace.
Dryden's harshness was readily understood at the time. The Achitophel he described so unfavourably was simply a literary device. The poem's real subject matter was political, a thinly veiled attack on those political leaders opposed to the succession of James, the Duke of York. The Absalom figure was the Duke's rival for the succession, King Charles' illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, while Achitophel was Monmouth's supporter, the Earl of Shaftesbury. Dryden's great work is part of a branch of literature with its roots firmly in Roman times, a literary form that, more than any other, defines the Augustan Age, the satire.
The origins of satire in the classical world are rather murky and lost in the mists of time. It seems to have originated in primitive abuse and cursing and in anarchic comedy. Satire only really became organised as a formal literary mode in the Roman world with the satirist Lucilius in the Republic, and then especially with Horace under Augustus, who gave satire a tremendous status which it hadn't previously possessed.
Satire works by enabling the satirist and his readers to feel comfortably superior to the target of the satire. One can see this very clearly in Absalom and Achitophel, which ridicules Dryden's political enemies and enables Dryden's allies to feel comfortably superior to the enemies that are being ridiculed. It also works in a more complex manner, I think, by trying to create differences between the audience, the satirist, and the targets of the satire. Differences that don't necessarily exist in real life, but have to be, as it were, created. There is always that fear that in creating those differences are not fully sustainable, and that one may be contaminated by the very thing one fears, the thing one thinks is opposite to oneself.
The English Augustan Age was a golden age for satire in all artistic fields. The early 18th century was the time of Jonathan Swift, creator of the greatest of all English-language satires, Gulliver's Travels. It was also the time when the painter William Hogarth produced his satirical masterpiece, Marriage à la Mode. And all three great poets of the age were all masters of the genre, with John Dryden leading the way. Not all of his satires were concerned with high politics. He was also prepared to turn his attention to his own professional rivals, as in Macflecknoe, a verse satire from 1682.
Share alone my perfect image bears, mature in dullness from his tender years. Share alone of all my sons is he, who stands confirmed in full stupidity. The rest, to some faint meaning, make pretence, but Share never deviates into sense. Some beams of wit on other souls may fall, strike through and make a lucid interval. But Share's genuine light admits no ray. His rising fogs prevail upon the day.
The sh in question was Thomas Shadwell, a fellow dramatist and bitter rival. Macflecknoe was Dryden's stinging response to an attack by Shadwell in The Medal of John Bayers, a satirical work from earlier in 1682. Unfortunately for Dryden, the outcome of his feud with Shadwell was ultimately unfavourable. In 1688, the Catholic King James II was deposed and the Protestant King William installed. As a recent convert to Catholicism, Dryden found himself out of favour. He was stripped of his position as poet laureate and replaced by his great rival. This change of faith, along with his earlier shift in political allegiance, has always been the subject of discussion for students of John Dryden.
I think Dryden always had a sense of the need for there to be some central authority. For example, in a poem like Religio Laici, A Layman's Faith of 1682, there's always a sense in which reason is not enough. The Protestant faith in being able to interpret things on your own level by translating the Latin into the vernacular, by approaching God in a more personal sense. Dryden has always seen that as being fraught with pitfalls. It's always a very thorny path, that. At the start of Religio Laici, he likens the borrowed beams, as he puts it, of nightly tapers, candles, which when morning arrives after the night is completely eclipsed by the effulgence of the sun. Our reason is like those candles, casting a little area of illumination when all around has the potential to be extremely unknowable and unchartable.
Well, critics are very often cynical about Dryden's conversion to Catholicism. He openly came out as a Catholic in 1686, and it was clearly politically advantageous for him to do so. It enabled him, for example, to make quite sure of keeping his poet laureateship, and as a poet quite hard-pressed for cash, the £575 that brought was very useful to him. On the other hand, it should be borne in mind that Dryden did not reconvert to Protestantism when it became advantageous for him to do this as well. In 1688, when James II was ousted by William III, it's quite clear that had Dryden opted to return to Protestantism, he could have retained his laureateship, carried on with his salary, and would not have been disadvantaged, instead of which he continued as a Catholic, had to pay double taxes, and lost a very valuable source of income.
In the years after 1688, Dryden's efforts were increasingly devoted to the business of translation, including the works of Virgil and, appropriately, the greatest of all Roman satirists, Juvenal. Throughout his career, Dryden was attracted to and influenced by the literary masterpieces of Rome. The strength and balance of his work is testimony to that influence. Perhaps just one of his many elegies is enough to give a full flavour of his genius.
Oh, early ripe, to thy abundant store, what could advancing age have added more? It might, what nature never gives the young, have taught the numbers of thy native tongue. But satire needs not those, and wit will shine through the harsh cadence of a rugged line. A noble error, and but seldom made, when poets are by too much force betrayed. Thy generous fruits, though gathered ere their prime, still showed a quickness and maturing time, but mellows what we write to the dull sweets of rhyme. Once more, hail and farewell. Farewell, thou young, but too short, Marcellus of our tongue. Thy brows with ivy and with laurels bound, but fate and gloomy night encompass thee around.
The elegy is one of the three poetic forms that most characterises the Augustan Age, along with satire and, perhaps less significantly, the poem that praises a public figure, the panegyric. For the second of the three great poets of the Augustan Age, Alexander Pope, the elegy was a form of verse to which he regularly turned. And in one of his finest works, written in the year 1717, the depth of his mournfulness is remarkable.
So peaceful rests, without a stone, a name, what once had beauty, titles, wealth, and fame. How loved, how honoured once, avails thee not, to whom related or by whom begot. A heap of dust alone remains of thee. 'Tis all thou art, and all the proud shall be.
Born in London in 1688, the same year as Dryden's ousting as poet laureate, Alexander Pope would be strongly influenced by the works of Dryden, and he shared with the older man a love of the literature of Rome. As a boy, he read widely amongst the classics. His love of books was, perhaps, forced upon him. A grave illness left him deformed and physically weakened. His adult height was just 4'6", and throughout his life he was tormented by terrible headaches. Despite this, his poetic talent shone early. At the age of just 16, he began to frequent the salons of London's literary establishment. And in 1711, his youthful verses made him a well-known figure, on intimate terms with many of his fellow writers, especially Jonathan Swift. And it was in 1711 that he produced his first great masterpiece, an essay on criticism. It was a teasing, dazzling verse, some 740 lines in length, and its subject matter was the business of artistic taste as understood and practiced by the sophisticated society of his day. It was a tour de force, and amongst its couplets are phrases that are now part of the English language.
A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring. There, shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. Fired at first sight with what the muse imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the heights of arts, while from the bounded level of our mind, short views we take, nor see the lengths behind. But, more advanced, behold with surprise, new distant scenes of endless science rise.
Pope's essay on criticism was a fearless piece of work, the creation of a young man utterly convinced of his own abilities. In its entirety, it offers the reader a panoramic view of the character and taste of London at the time of Queen Anne.
Pope's essay on criticism was undoubtedly a tremendous achievement. It was his first great poem. We have to remember that it was published before he was 23 years of age, and it represents an extraordinary synthesis of the critical ideas of the time in order to provide at the same time a manifesto for the kinds of poetry that he wants to write and a subtle self-advertisement. He succeeds in the extraordinary task of making literary critical commonplaces seem interesting, amusing, and even beautiful.
With its contemporary subject matter and heroic poetic structure, it continues the tradition of Dryden. And Pope's use of satire is, if anything, even more devastating than that of his predecessor. Unsurprisingly, it is those contemporary literary figures less talented than himself who were the target of some of Pope's cruelest satirical attacks.
Some have thirst for wits, then poets passed, turned critics next, and proved plain fools at last. Some neither can for wits nor critics pass, as heavy mules are neither horse nor ass. Those half-learned witlings are numerous in our isle, as half-formed insects on the banks of the Nile. Unfinished things one knows not what to call, their generation so equivocal. To tell 'em would 100 tongues require, or one vain wit's that might 100 tire.
Pope's essay on criticism is a remarkable achievement for a young man of 23. It teaches its readers how to become not only critics but writers, yet paradoxically would fill them with a sense of despair about ever being able to do either as well as Pope, and I suspect that's partly the purpose of the poem. Pope's objective, I think partly, was to create the critical standards by which he himself hoped to be judged as a future poet. One of the interesting features about the poem is the way in which, although it sets out the rules for good criticism and good writing, it also emphasises that element, that superfluity, that excess in writing which cannot be defined by rules, what Pope calls the grace beyond the reach of art. And I think it's this grace beyond the reach of art, this excess, this special quality which the poem sets out to demonstrate.
There is a vogue within the period for the sublime, a treatise which is written by somebody who goes under the name, although we don't know whether it was a real name, of Longinus. And what Longinus says is that the best poetic effects, the best literary effects, occur when you are not in your proper senses. You're not conscious of holding the book in your hand. You've gone into a different realm. And Pope embraces that in the essay on criticism. He realizes that there comes a point at which a very correct poet can write very correct poems, but at the end of the day they'll not be great ones. So I think it's more liberal than may appear at first glance.
If the essay on criticism made Pope a noted figure in London society, his next masterpiece made him famous. Again, it was a work of penetrating satire, an attack on those individuals who possess an inflated sense of their own importance. To achieve his aim, Pope constructed a verse narrative whose subject matter was almost negligible. a young nobleman becomes smitten by an attractive young woman and decides to take a lock of her hair as a physical reminder of his fancy.
The adventurous baron the bright locks admired. He saw, he wished, and to the prize aspired. Resolved to win, he meditates the way, for force to ravish, or by fraud betray. For when success a lover's toil attends, few ask if fraud or force attained his ends.
The taking or raping of the young woman's hair provides the title and the starting point for this poem, first published in 1712. Pope's achievement was to create a mock epic out of this event, as if this utterly insignificant action was as important as a great event in history.
The Rape of the Lock is based on a real incident where a young Catholic aristocrat did snip the lock off Arabella Fermor as a kind of act of flirtation. Arabella Fermor was extremely incensed by this, understandably, and Pope was asked to write the poem to laugh the two families back together again.
He imagines the story to be rather like the abduction of Helen of Troy by Paris and the Trojan War that ensues, and he installs a full epic machinery that tones the conventions and the mythological creatures that you normally find in epic poems, I think partly to show that the way in which the family had got things out of all proportion. The most interesting aspect of the mythological machinery of the poem are the sylphs, the kind of guardian angels that look after the virtue and the emotions of young ladies. And they're rather like the little animals you get in Disney films. They're sometimes hyperactive, spiteful, always busying themselves around the main action of the characters.
It traces a typical day, up to a moment of crisis, of someone he calls Belinda, waking up at the crack of noon in the morning, applying of the cosmetic powers in front of a looking glass, which he calls the rites of pride. But at the same time as we're encouraged, I suppose, to feel that this is trivial and we really ought to be taking a critical view of this, there's an accompanying sense that there's a kind of beauty that Belinda has. It may be based on sort of very flimsy foundations, but this is the consumer society at its best. And this secure vessel is depicted afloat on the Thames in very beautiful writing, I have to say.
She goes out on a boat trip to Hampton Court and very unwisely engages in a game of cards with the Baron and his friends. She triumphantly wins the card game, but she's lucky at cards, unlucky in love. The Baron seizes the lock, and the rest of the poem concerns her elaborate overreaction.
She is furious. He treats the snipping of the lock like a sexual conquest. She considers that her honour has been stained, and despite the best efforts of reasonable people present, an enormous fight ensues with scissors, with bodkins, with snuff boxes, and it all degenerates into a dreadful situation until finally the lock is lost. At the end of the poem, Pope explains that the lock is going to become a star in the skies.
Pope describes it as in fact floating up and forming, being transformed as Ovid would metamorphose an object for its own security. This poem will keep permanent the memory of Belinda and will consecrate forever her name. It's also, it turns out to be, rather unexpectedly, a testament to the power of poetry to keep things permanent, to celebrate things which in their own natures may appear to be transitory, preliminary, and so on. But it has a power of demonstrating that even the trivial could be rendered beautiful, could be rendered a permanent testament to a very complex set of forces.
The Rape of the Lock proved without doubt that the 24-year-old Alexander Pope had arrived as a great poet of his age. More success came in 1713 with Windsor Forest, the poem inspired by the place where he spent much of his boyhood. Its publication proved that Pope himself was prepared to use his work to advance his own position in society. He modified the poem to include praise for the recently signed Treaty of Utrecht, and he dedicated it to a government minister of the time, Lord Lansdowne. The society of which he was a part continued to provide inspiration for his work, especially his satire. With his friend Jonathan Swift, he regularly wrote mocking reviews of those fellow writers he considered inferior. What Pope considered to be the sheer dullness of many of his contemporaries would provide much of the inspiration for his final poetic masterpiece, the Dunciad. a long composition which occupied him until 1743. Again, the subject matter is contemporary, the London society of Pope's day. And Pope's satirical intentions are made clear right from the earliest lines with his introduction of the Queen of Dullness.
In clouded majesty here dullness shone. 4 guardian virtues round support her throne. Fierce champion fortitude, that knows no fears of hisses, blow, or want, or loss of ears. Calm temperance, whose blessings those partake who hunger and who thirst for scribbling's sake. Prudence, whose glass presents the approaching jail. Poetic justice, with her lifted scale, where in nice balance truth with gold she weighs, and solid pudding against empty praise.
There's no doubt that Pope's Dunciad began out of spiteful motives. He attempted in this poem to swat to death a series of his literary enemies. "This will rid me of these insects," he said.
It's a remarkable poem. It's partly about the dumbing down of culture in Pope's age as he saw it, and obviously considers his own art to be quite detached from that process of dumbing down. But it's also about the political consequences of the commercialisation of culture. George II came to the throne in 1727, and the first version of the Dunciad was written around that time and published in 1728. And this king, like his predecessor, showed very little interest in fostering an independent, critical kind of art. And one of the things that the poem is doing is warning about the political consequences of a general literary culture of sycophancy and cliché.
The Dunciad represents the most enduring achievements of the later career of Alexander Pope, but it was not the only one. In his epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot of 1735, his satire is shot through with an unusually personal sense of perspective. His description of his own father remains especially memorable.
Stranger to civil and religious rage, the good man walked innocuous through his age. No courts he saw, no suits would ever try, nor dared an oath, nor hazarded a lie. Unlearns, he knew no schoolman's subtle art, no language, but the language of the heart. By nature honest, by experience wise, healthy by temperance and by exercise. His life, though long, to sickness passed unknown. His death was instant and without a groan. Oh, grant me thus to live, and thus to die. Who sprung from kings shall know less joy than I.
As a poet of the Augustan age, it was appropriate that Alexander Pope spent much of his later career immersed in the original texts of the Roman masters. His final works were English versions of the works of the Roman writer Horace, himself a product of the first Augustan age. Typically, imitations of Horace were not translations, but versions of Horace's satirical works set against the background of his own times and published in 1739. The previous year, another poet had carried out a similar task with the work of another Roman satirist, Juvenal. This 29-year-old Englishman would emerge as the third and last of the great poets of the Augustan age, although his literary achievements extended far beyond the composition of verse. He remains one of the most famous of all English men of letters, Dr. Samuel Johnson. Johnson was born in 1709 in the town of Lichfield, where he attended the local grammar school. He attended the University of Oxford, but lack of funds forced him to leave before taking his degree. In the early 1730s, he was briefly a schoolmaster before setting up his own school not far from his birthplace. The school did not last long, but one of the pupils that did attend was a teenage boy named David Garrick. Johnson and Garrick struck up a close friendship, and when Johnson decided to close his school in 1737 and move to London, the 20-year-old David Garrick went with him. Both men had dreams of fame, and both would succeed in their aim. Garrick would become the most famous English actor of his day, while Samuel Johnson would become its most famous man of letters.
Professional writing had been Johnson's lifeline. He was broke and depressed when he went to London and became a professional writer, and he was essentially a jobbing journalist for about 20 years before he achieved any kind of fame or stability. So Johnson wrote an enormous amount, mostly in prose.
A year after his move to the British capital, Johnson produced his first memorable work, a poem inspired by and named after the city where he now found himself. This was his updating of one of Juvenal's Roman satires, the third satire written during the early 2nd century AD. Juvenal's satires exposed brilliantly the contradictions, hypocrisies, and simple baseness that characterized much of everyday life in Rome. His observations on the power of money to influence human behavior were especially remarkable. It was a theme taken up in Johnson's poem written some 16 centuries later.
Here let those reign whom pensions can incite to vote a patriot black, a courtier white, explain their country's dear-bought rights away, and plead for pirates in the light of day, with slavish tenets taint our poisoned youth, and lend a lie the confidence of truth.
Johnson imitates Juvenal in his two greatest poems. He admires Juvenal's moral indignation, but Juvenal is a notoriously topical and scurrilous poet whose works are full of sexual scandal, and Johnson certainly has no truck with that side of Juvenal. So he adopts Juvenal's basic scheme in London, particularly the scheme of escaping from a corrupt city into a virtuous countryside. Johnson himself certainly believes that contemporary London is corrupt, but Johnson is well known for having hated life in the country and loving life in the town. He says that those who live in the country are fit for the country. So he is to some extent in London adopting a literary pose with which he's not entirely comfortable. And there's no doubt at all that he alters the tone of Juvenal's poem to a very considerable extent, leaving out much of the contemporary scandal and instead concentrating on the moral indignation.
There is an equation which Johnson draws in London between Juvenal's sense of a Rome in decay, which he contrasts with this unthinking, communal celebration of London being very much on the up, as a commercial power, as an imperial expansionist force. What he's really saying is that it isn't actually so much different from Juvenal's Rome, a Rome which is past its best, which is on the way down.
Many modern readers are surprised when they first discover the satire of Juvenal. The strength of his language and the bitterness of much of his verse leaves the reader in no doubt about what might be termed the darker side of the great city of Rome. In addition, many modern readers find his attacks on women and homosexuals distasteful, but there can be no doubting Juvenal's position as a giant of the satirical tradition. Time and again, Johnson turned to him for inspiration. In 1749, he published The Vanity of Human Wishes, a poem based on the 10th of Juvenal's 16 known satires. Its structure is unusual. It alternates between descriptions of human character types and the depictions of real historical figures. One of these is the powerful Tudor statesman and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey.
In full-blown dignity see Wolsey stand, law in his voice and fortune in his hand. To him the church, the realm their powers consign. Through him the rays of regal bounty shine. Turned by his nod, the stream of honour flows. His smile alone security bestows. Still to new heights his restless wishes tower. Claim leads to claim, and power advances power, till conquest unresisted ceased to please, and right submitted left him none to seize.
But Wolsey's fate was the same as that of many political figures who grow too powerful, and Johnson details his eventual fall from power in a succession of merciless couplets.
At length his sovereign frowns. The train of state mark the keen glance, and watch the sign to hate. Where'er he turns he meets a stranger's eye. His suppliants scorn him, and his followers fly. Now drops at once the pride of awful state, the golden canopy, the glittering plate, the regal palace, the luxurious board, the liveried army and the menial lord. With age, With cares, with maladies oppressed, he seeks the refuge of monastic rest. Grief aids disease, remembered folly stings, and his last sighs reproach the faith of kings.
Johnson's poetic condemnation of a politician grown too big for his boots and his obvious delight in his eventual downfall is strikingly contemporary in its satirical message. In the remainder of the poem, Johnson turned his satirical attention to such diverse historical figures as King Xerxes of Persia and Charles XII of Sweden.
The Vanity of Human Wishes is about vanity in a double sense. It's about the futility of hoping for anything at all, given that inevitably life is full of catastrophes, disasters, and we're all going to die in the end. And it's also about the kinds of vanities we invest in our everyday hopes and aspirations and our wish for happiness. All of these, Johnson says, are often in some way perverted by the vain desire for fame, for power, for dominion over others. At the end of the poem, Johnson urges us to entrust our wishes and hopes to God and reassures his readers that happiness is something that will come their way if they don't actively seek it out.
Pour forth thy fervours for a healthful mind, obedient passions and a will resigned, for love, which scarce collective man can fill, for patience, sovereign o'er transmuted ill, for faith, that panting for a happier seat, counts death kind signal of retreat. Those goods for man the laws of heaven ordain, these goods he grants, who grants the power to gain. With these celestial wisdom calms the mind, and makes the happiness she does not find.
Johnson doesn't wish to squash the human desire for happiness and fulfillment and pleasure. What he wants to do is to show that human beings have set that aspiration in the wrong places and that they're therefore inevitably condemned to frustration. So in the end of the poem, he proposes, out of his own experience and out of the wisdom of tradition, the idea that that happiness can only finally be fulfilled in God.
By the time The Vanity of Human Wishes was published, Samuel Johnson had begun work on the project with which he is most associated today, his great Dictionary of the English Language. This was a formidable achievement, a painstakingly researched lexicon of over 40,000 words. He also worked extensively for magazines. In 1764, he founded the Literary Club with many of the leading artistic figures of the day, including his old friend David Garrick, the political philosopher Edmund Burke, and the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. Samuel Johnson also became the subject of the most famous of all English literary biographies written by his devoted friend James Boswell.
Boswell, when he writes his life of Johnson, creates a Johnson that is a literary lion, somebody that everybody would find sometimes quite effortlessly in control of this image. And yet if you step outside Boswell, you'd find more and more a sense of the cost, the human cost that Johnson had to live of his own, to be a provincial within a society that complemented itself on its elites and its pecking order. Johnson never lost his Staffordshire accent. His public persona was hampered by the fact that he was often given to sort of nervous tics and unfortunate tremors as well. And so he was not your archetypal media talking head by any means. He was in fact somebody who had a kind of rugged integrity, which he never sacrificed at all. And Boswell and others have celebrated that image and the reality, I think, of Johnson the man. And I think that that established a sense of reasoned literary debate that lived on in a sort of clubbable way, lived on well into the 19th century.
Because of all these achievements, it is easy to forget his status as a poet. Like his Augustan predecessors, Pope and Dryden, he mastered the handling of the rhyming couplet. Like them, he was profoundly influenced by the work of the Romans, and his satire is timeless evidence for this. In addition, Johnson mastered fully that other popular Augustan poetic form, the elegy. And of all his poems in honour of the dead, there are few finer examples than his epitaph on William Hogarth. It is entirely appropriate that the painter who brought satire into visual art should be remembered by one of the great masters of satirical verse.
The hand of art here torpid lies, that waved the essential form of grace, Here death has closed the curious eyes that saw the manners in his face. If genius warm thee, reader, stay. If merit touch thee, shed a tear. Be vice and dullness far away. Great Hogarth's honoured dust is here.
In 1781, just 3 years before his death, the now famous Samuel Johnson was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Oxford. Dr. Johnson is the name by which history now remembers him. His death in 1784 can be seen as the end of the Augustan Age of English poetry. The French Revolution was looming, as was the age of Romanticism. In England, the Romantic Age would produce some of that country's greatest ever poets. Soon, the calmness and balanced structure of the Augustan Age would be swept from favour with an emphasis on passion, nature and the imagination. But the work of Dryden, Pope and Dr. Johnson has never been forgotten, and together their work is now fully recognised as a great age in the history of English verse.
The achievement of Dryden, Pope and Johnson, but also of their contemporaries of writers such as Anne Finch, John Gay, of course Jonathan Swift and Mary Wortley Montagu, was to produce a uniquely witty poetry, but also a poetry which reflects profoundly on the poetic liabilities and public responsibilities of that wit. It's a uniquely compressed kind of poetry, not an introspective or necessarily a narrative or a lyrical kind of poetry, but one which has the kind of fire of igneous rock. It combines uniquely precision with energy, and I think it's a poetry which creates some of the most memorable monsters in the English language. The dunces, Charles XII of Sweden, Achitophel, characters with explosive energy compressed into heroic couplets.
Within the Augustan period, there's a sense in which you find individual poets actually finding a code within satire to talk about a sense of exile. The sociological term nowadays would be anomie, a sense of being not quite part of the public and the mainstream. It sounds contradictory, but they indeed talked in a very public mode, but felt as if they were disjoined from it. When Swift went back to Ireland from 1714 onwards and wrote Gulliver's Travels and wrote many of his very personable and also very individualistic poems, he's exploring a sense of why the self has been fractured. Same with Pope in the 1730s. So I think increasingly there's a sort of dark underside of alienation, which is common to most of the really successful poets of the Augustan period.
In my view, this period sees the development of many of the institutions of modern society that we take for granted. Banking, a consumer society, a strong middle-class culture, party politics, journalism, a professional literary class. Yet the greatest writers of the period, as we've seen, are essentially traditionalists. They believe in aristocratic and landed values, they come from an Orthodox Christian background, and they're classicist in their approach to literature. They therefore confront these new developments in a rather ambiguous way. They're certainly not entirely against everything that's happening in their time, but they're far from being advocates of it either. I find the special fascination of the literature of this period in the power and wit with which these great traditionalist writers confront their emerging new society.